Hi, I'm Paul J. Welcome to the theAnalysis.news podcast. Back in mid-April, before the mass protests broke out, I wrote an article titled, "Get Ready for the Coming Storm." In part, it went, "Now, as the country settles into deep depression, conditions for the rise of a broad people's movement might develop. Mass unemployment could spark spontaneous resistance, but without organization, uprisings cannot be sustained and have little direction. I saw this firsthand during the Freddie Gray protests in Baltimore. Will progressives and socialists be ready for it? Well, the storm arrived sooner than I expected. I think if the mass movement that has arisen in the wake of the police murders of George Floyd and many other black men is going to be sustainable and transformative, workers organized in trade unions are going to have to play a leading role. It's almost the only place that workers are organized as workers. Even if their numbers are much smaller than in the past, unionized workers are still in strategic sectors of the economy, including transportation, telecommunications, the public sector, hospitals, and many large industries. An example of what's possible may be set by the West Coast port workers on Friday, Juneteenth. Members of the International Longshore and Warehouse Union, ILWU, plan to close West Coast ports in solidarity with Black Lives Matter on the day commemorating the end of slavery. While many, even on the left, have written off American trade unions as too weak and too conservative, in fact, there are strikes all over the country, and some say a rising militancy. In the book Labor in the Time of Trump, the introduction ends with this: building corporate lobbies and the right-wing ideology surrounding them is fundamental to capitalism, as is the impulse to generate wealth at the top and eliminate unions. How the labor movement responds, however, is generating fierce debates within the labor movement. The right-wing agenda is at odds with what most people want, and it's up to the labor movement and its allies to expose and counter the contradiction. The challenge for labor and the left is to marshal the forces that believe another world is possible. Now joining us is one of the editors of the book, Clare Hammonds, who is a professor of practice, UMass Amherst Labor Center, where she conducts and supports applied research and the labor education program. Hammonds also currently serves as the Labor Center Graduate Program Director. And one of the contributors to the book in Chicago is Cedric Johnson, who's an associate professor of African American Studies and Political Science at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and editor of The Neoliberal Deluge, Hurricane Katrina, Late Capitalism, and the Remaking of New Orleans. Thank you both for joining me.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks.
So Clare, in the book's dedication, it talks about laying the groundwork for the next upsurge. Do you think this is it? And if so, can the progressive struggle inside the union movement effectively challenge the conservatives who lead most, not all, of the major unions?
Yeah, well, I guess I'll just start by saying a couple of things about that. So this book itself, there's 5 co-editors on it. So myself and the other 3 UMass Amherst faculty at the Labor Center, Jasmine Karasi, Eve Weinbaum, and Time Jurovich. And we were also supported in writing that by our sociology colleague, Dan Clausen. And Dan Clausen passed away unexpectedly last May, just after we'd finished putting the book together. And that introduction there is actually a reference to a book that he wrote in the early 2000s, maybe 2002 or so, that's called The Next Upsurge. And it's a really important book. And one of the things he really argues in it is that if you look at the history of the labor movement and of union growth, unions have never grown slowly and incrementally. But rather we've seen these large explosions in growth, right? So if we look at the period following the Great Depression and those sort of 10 years or so between 1934 and 1944, membership in the labor movement quadrupled during that period. And so, he's pointing out that if we just look at the sort of slow, steady decline of the last several decades, you're given one picture of where the labor movement is headed. But in reality, that, the data suggests that actually we might not know when it's coming, and it might come in these huge sort of large bursts. And, so just in response then to your question, sort of following up on that about sort of whether or not these internal political progressive struggles make a difference, I have two sort of initial thoughts to that. And, my first answer is yes, which is to say that unions are democratic organizations run by elected leaders. And as is the case in all types of democratic systems, it's often the case that those in power are in a position to maintain that power by setting rules in various ways. But that's not to say that that there aren't avenues for new kinds of leadership to emerge within that democratic context. And I think there's lots of examples from the labor movement, even just looking in the last decade, where we've really seen progressive struggles within unions actually transform them. And, I think of the teachers' unions often, and they've really very much been at the forefront of a lot of these progressive transformations within the labor movement. And part of it is that they're public sector unions that are well positioned to make common cause with community organizations. They're often very much embedded in the community in ways that perhaps advantage them to this kind of struggle, but we've really seen them leading the way. Actually here in Massachusetts, my union, the Massachusetts Teachers Association, had a real transformation about 6 years ago. A Democratic caucus within the union was able to organize rank and file members and elect a new, very progressive Democratic president. And, in that period of time following it, we've seen like a real transformation of the union at the state level, including, an aggressive campaign that pushed back against charter schools in the state and was able to win on that. We won sort of additional changes around the funding formula, which is how money gets allocated at the school to different schools in a way that really increased funding for public education. And I would say it's also, this will become increasingly important as resources in the public sector become more scarce in the economic fallout of the COVID pandemic. I guess just one other thing I would say in response to your question is that outside of the role of, progressive organizing happening within unions and within labor movement, I think it's also really important to look at the broader social movement sort of ecosystem, if you will, and sort of considering the interactive effects among these movements. Certainly since the beginning of June, we've seen massive protests around Black Lives Matter and anti-Black racism that I think, have really pushed the labor movement in new ways to urgently confront issues of racism within their membership and to think about how it is that they organize in coalition with movements for racial justice.
Cedric, to what extent do you think this is the next upsurge? And if it is, how much influence will it have in the unions within and outside the unions, amongst the workers' movement? I mean, does this lead to a campaign of organizing? Claire's talking about times when union membership can surge. Well, if there was ever a moment where it was needed, it's now. But are the union leaders of most of the unions, and there are exceptions, but most of the unions have not been very good at organizing and not very good at confronting, especially the leadership of the Democratic Party. So will this be a spark that will help push this kind of progressive motion in the unions?
I mean, I definitely think it's possible, right? The pandemic, did a few things for us that I think, as Clare pointed out, it sort of jolted people out of their typical way of doing things. For one, I'll go down a few changes that I think it helped to precipitate, at least in how people think about labor, right? The focus on essential workers and the kinds of conversations I heard people having about this, I think because of the induced slowdown, right? And for some people, it was a slowdown. Some people could work from home, people working in certain professions that allowed them that kind of flexibility. And it's not like that was necessarily a good thing. I mean, many people complained loudly that this was more oppressive, right? That now they were forced with a different kind of labor discipline that didn't even allow their homes to be a place of egress, but now they were at the beck and command of their bosses or managers at all times. So even among better situated workers, this presented some problems. But I think for all of us as a consumer public, right, we realized that there were many occupations which we relied on. And in the midst of the pandemic, that became incredibly vivid and clear to us, right, that whether it was the delivery services that folks were using, grocery stores, and the various shipping channels and transportation that connect those to the port system and what have you, we realized that there were certain workers in society that were essential for all of us, right? Really fundamental to our basic reproduction on a day-to-day basis, who also were underpaid, not protected, not provided with adequate personal protective equipment in the midst of a pandemic. And what was great about that moment of shelter in place is you saw companies like Amazon openly criticized, right, even in mainstream media, and workers staging sick outs and walkouts, right, and then Amazon retaliating almost in 19th century fashion by firing those persons who were organizing, and then also rebellion even from more privileged stratum within Amazon. I saw where one engineer resigned and condemned Amazon for basically firing whistleblowers within its ranks. And so I think the focus on essential workers, whether those were frontline emergency and healthcare workers, but also people whose services and labor we rely on a day-to-day basis, right, and maybe take for granted. I think people finally begin to pay attention to those experiences in the same ways that the shelter in place also allowed the killing of Ahmaud Arbery and also George Floyd to resonate in ways that it might not have before, when those stories would have competed with all sorts of other news stories or distractions that Americans are typically caught up in. So I think the shelter in place and the focus on essential workers really has helped us, and it's set the stage for something else, right? I mean, I think it's possible that we will see a wave of labor organizing if things continue to go this way. And what's helping it in part is having a Republican controlled Senate and a White House which doesn't give a damn about these people, right? And responded with one of the most, tokenizing measures. I mean, a pittance for the most part in terms of relief for people who were enduring, this pandemic and not allowed to work, right? So I think the various conditions of the pandemic have created an opening for us. But I think, again, the work lies ahead. It's not gonna happen just because of outrage, but it's gonna happen because of the tireless work. The other thing, and I'll kind of close with this part. In my own, mine and Claire's own profession, right, as academics, right? I mean, I think we've all seen, or at least heard, various for-profit ed entrepreneurs seize this moment, right? And as in other crises, right, they're looking for the opportunity to transform higher education. I mean, some of it is they're overselling it, right? I mean, I don't think we're going to see a complete total overhaul, but where they can succeed to erode the power of unionized faculty, move courses towards online education, get rid of entire layers of non-unionized or contingent faculty. I think we're going to see that, right, in some places. So I think that the stage is being set for important struggles ahead, but we've got to be, we've got to be prepared to do the work.
Claire, usually at times like this, especially given the election, the significance of the November election with Trump, and of course, people in the union movement want Trump defeated. But so often with these rises of the mass movement, especially around elections, most of the union leadership are so preoccupied and focused on funding the Democratic Party and getting people out organizing for the Democratic Party that they don't organize, first of all, the unions themselves in terms of getting new members. And then especially at a time like this, if there was ever a time that unions need to organize the unemployed, and to create that as a real force, as it was in the 1930s, that time is now. But I think that goes to the same question of the struggle within the unions. Like, are the unions there, to represent workers as a whole, as a class, and get away from this much more narrow vision of what unions are? The UAW always, had such a good healthcare plan. The UAW didn't care much about Medicare for all. Of course, now none of those big unions are in good shape. So is there a time now where the unions can start playing more of that kind of class role?
I think there is. I mean, and what you've pointed to is, I guess, the sort of huge explosion in unemployment. And, I think certainly history has important lessons for us. And, the period sort of in the New Deal era in which the labor movement was successful in pushing forward pro-worker policies. There was a substantial amount of labor unrest and organizing that include coalitions of both employed and unemployed workers. I think the question of where unemployment will land is still an open one. And I guess, in some ways that feels like it feels like there's such immediate work that needs to be done by the labor movement in terms of both internal organizing and trying to work with, and as you've pointed out, and Cedric pointed out as well, like we've seen this sort of massive unrest happening among unorganized workers, right? So we're talking about Amazon workers, we're talking about workers in the gig economy, and that since the start of the pandemic, those numbers of wildcat strikes have really been significant. And one of the questions I think is, how the labor movement is able to grapple with the fact that so much of this organizing is happening outside of the union context, right? And what does it do with that? And how is it that we then take that organizing that's happening and transform it into sort of sustained organization that can be able to make real change. And I would just sort of also point to the fact that we have seen these increases in labor unrest happening recently since the pandemic began, and we've seen other sorts of protest movements happening. But there has been a certain amount of this isn't exactly brand new. If we look even just in the last several years, more workers went on strike in 2018 than in any time since 1986. And so we are sort of starting to see this uptick in worker unrest, and perhaps this is a culmination of it. But I think from the, in terms of the organizing that the labor movement has to do, I mean, it is a class-based movement and an economic-based movement, and that's at the heart of it. And, building common cause with community members and other sorts of issues that affect workers in their communities, whether it be around housing, whether it be around race, and whether it be around policing, environmental issues, schooling, et cetera. Like those are all places where I think the labor movement can be organizing in coalition.
In the introduction to the book, Cedric, there's this suggestion that there's a debate in the union movement about how to respond to the current situation. What is the debate?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are many different different kinds of debates. I mean, I think, if we think about that part of the book as speaking to the current moment, and the wave of unprecedented protests we've seen, around the country, I think there's a way to not only for unions to become involved in terms of resources, right, and connecting with social struggles, and some of them are already doing that, in different parts of the country. I know when I participated in protests against the killing of Laquan McDonald here in Chicago, which those protests kind of took off in 2015, even though he was killed a year before. There were unions that were out there, right? And I mean, I think maybe one way to think about it is, the people who are being heavily policed are workers, working class people, right? And there are many moments where we see those who are unionized. If we think about people like Philando Castile, who was a cafeteria worker, and I think was also a member of a Teamsters local in St. Paul, or somebody like a George Floyd, who had been a truck driver and was unemployed as a bouncer. I mean, all of these folks are part of the working class, right? So I think the first step, maybe in getting past those debates, is to concede that these are working class people, right? I remember there's a great passage from Michael Zweig, where he talks about the poor and basically tries to take back this discussion of class from decades of liberalism, which tries to parse out or separate the poor and the dependent from workers, right? And I think he basically says that, who are the poor but ruined workers, right? They're people who have been ground up and cast aside by this particular economy. And I think we have to think about it in the same way. So I don't see those divides as being as sharp between those persons who are actively organizing in their workplaces and the people beyond the shop floor, so to speak. I just think we have to one, step into this with the idea that most Americans are still working class, even if our salaries may vary widely, our consumer capacity may vary widely, but ultimately most of us rely upon a wage in order to survive, right? We don't own, vast tracts of land. We don't own central city real estate. And so the way we reproduce ourselves is through selling our labor power. And if we get back to that kind of basic idea, I think it moves the conversation in a different direction. And so it makes sense that unions throw themselves fully behind anti-policing measures, which are meted out against, policing is meted out against the most vulnerable segments of the working class.
But supporting measures to restrain policing is not such a tough one for the unions. But with this coming election, and right now it looks like Biden's going to be president, I think the bigger question is going to be whether the unions are willing to force the Democratic Party to actually into some serious reforms, not nibbling around the edges as the Obama administration did. I mean, the Obama administration, one of their big reasons Obama got elected was this big promise to the union movement that they would pass I forget the name of the legislation right now, but it was a piece of legislation to make it easier for unions to organize. And they never passed the legislation after making all kinds of promises. As I say, this goes back to this issue of the fight within the unions, where there's a real progressive unions. Like, how many of the major unions supported Sanders? I don't think the majority did. Most either didn't do anything or they supported Biden. There are, of course, the nurses, communication workers that did support Sanders. And a lot of locals supported Sanders, sometimes in defiance of their national leadership. Is, I guess, the same question again. There's a kind of change in attitudes happening right now. This pandemic has been a big dose of reality. Do you get a feel for that in the unions? There will be, like Clare was talking about, a progressive slate got elected in her union. Might this be happening more across the country? Do you see any evidence of it, or maybe it's too soon to say?
I think when I see that the major unions supported Biden is disheartening. When the national organizations supported him, but I mean, I think that the Sanders campaign, was terribly important. I think it reminded us all that it was possible to run a progressive left, campaign at the national level, right? And that it was possible to win in some places with a candidacy which wasn't ashamed to talk about what kind of world we want, like what kind of society do we want? And that was uplifting, right? Even using the term socialist, right, openly, and the fact that he wasn't capsized as a candidate because of his long commitment to democratic socialism. That was an achievement. At the same time, I mean, if you live in certain parts of the country, it doesn't resonate in the same ways. If you live, I mean, I grew up in Louisiana, I have a lot of family still in the South. And in some of these places, the discussions are very different, right? You don't have these massive teacher strikes like we have here in Chicago. You may not even have any unions for the most part, right? That are worth talking about. So in these right to work states and states where you have Republicans, oftentimes in the governor's mansion and in control of the state legislature, voting for somebody like Sanders seems like a long shot, right? And it's just based on the reality on the ground. So I can imagine why Black voters in South Carolina, not even imagine, I know why they voted for Biden. It's because he seemed like the person who could possibly get elected. And they've lived through too many, especially if there's somebody who's an older Black person in South Carolina. They've lived through too many heartbreaking disappointments as far as elections to place their bets on Sanders, who didn't have the blessing of the local politicians, right, who they trust and who do deliver some sort of material or divisible benefits to them on a regular basis. So I think we will probably see more election of progressive candidates in local places where that's possible. We will see changes as far as like union leadership. I can imagine more in the way of, diversification of union leadership, going forward, given everything that's happened over the last few weeks. But I'm not completely disappointed with the possibility of a Biden election, right? And I've said this in a few places. I think that we got to have a long game approach to this, right? That Biden is better than Trump. I think on some issues, if he changes the composition of the Congress at all, it puts us in a better position to push for things. I mean, just look at the damage that Trump has wrought as far as his appointments to different departments. I mean, Ben Carson is not the kind of person I want to see in charge of housing and urban development, right? We need other kinds of people in place. And sure, we can go by the track record of the centrist Democrats, which is also disappointing. But I think we'd be in a better place with somebody like a Biden. And given the energy that's been unleashed by, the pandemic, we might be in a better place to push for some different kinds of things than even what we saw during the Obama administration.
Clare, you're right in that introduction that the right-wing agenda is at odds with what most people want, and the labor movement has to try to deal with this. To what extent is that happening? We know that a lot of union members in Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania voted for Trump. Are the unions responding to this? And why do you think so many union members voted, it's pretty obvious, against their own interests, but they got fooled?
Well, I guess there's, two things, which is, first, this point that the right-wing agenda is really unpopular. I think it's worth separating out that agenda perhaps from the Republican Party. And sort of all that entails. I think there's sort of two things happening there. Because on its basis, when you're asking people these sort of questions about, like, do you want to have a good school in your neighborhood? Do you want to have affordable housing? Do you want to have a job? Like these sorts of basic things. The Republican agenda, is not very popular, right? It turns out people do really want to have access to health care that doesn't bankrupt them when they get sick, for example, right? So like on these issues, we see that people do generally support more liberal policies. And this is why I think in a lot of places you see things trying, people sort of moving outside of the legislative process to actually trying to pass ballot initiatives and sort of going directly to the people and putting things forward as a question, right? Because you're sometimes able to get more progressive policies through doing that than you are working, actually through the election process. On this question about why do so many union voters vote for Trump, I think there's a couple of things happening there. One, I think this question of union membership. A lot of people are union members. You don't identify as union members. Unions have moved to a place of oftentimes being essentially like an insurance policy for workers, right? You pay the union so that you have, some sort of benefits in case you have a problem at your job. You pay the union to help make sure that you get a better healthcare plan or a wage increase. And unions haven't necessarily been doing the kind of political education work that would help union members to see their broader class interests and to vote in different terms.
I've gone into unionized grocery stores and I've asked, what's the name of your union? And union members working at the cash can't tell me the name of their union. And I said, do you know who your steward is? And on several occasions, they have no idea even who their union rep is. The level of education in some of the unions is just terrible.
Yeah, so I think it's hard to if these people are sort of don't know who their steward is, don't know who their union is. Yes, they might pay union dues, but that's a different kind of membership, right? It's in a different kind of organization. So I think at a more fundamental level, what you're talking about is actually sort of transforming union organizations so that they are, engaging with their membership and doing the kind of political education work that would allow for the development of a class consciousness that would change some of these voting outcomes.
Is there any organization, and if there isn't, it sure seems to me there should be, that is there to help progressive workers who want to fight in their unions, to get elected, to develop slates, because I would guess in a lot of unionized places, some of the workers feel very isolated and they have no idea what to do. And the second thing is unorganized workers where, as I say, some unions do organize, but a lot do very little. And I've talked to quite a few workers. Sometimes they've reached out to me because, they watch the news I do. And they said, well, I'm unorganized, but I don't know what to do about it. Does there need to be a different kind of workers' organization outside of the traditional union structure that can talk to both progressives in traditional unions and to workers who want to get organized? Cedric, is there something like that, or should there be?
Well, ideally, right, I wish we had a political party that was actually representing the interests of working people. That would be great. That would be a place to start. In the meantime, I think maybe one way to accomplish it, right, would be the place of the campaign. I don't mean the electoral campaign, but the activist campaign, which could be, and oftentimes are led by unions, but other kinds of campaigns that we've seen, and some of those have intensified during the pandemic, that are still class inflected, even if they aren't necessarily formal worker organizations, right? So, and I'm thinking here of we could talk about Black Lives Matter, right? In a sense, there are some redistributive questions that are raised within that. Anti-eviction campaigns in different cities, people calling for moratoriums on evictions during the pandemic. But a lot of that work was being done before, and even going back as far as the subprime mortgage crisis, right? We've seen a expansion of housing activism especially within cities where it's no longer affordable for working people to live. So I think there's ways that these campaigns can serve as a bridge, but also a space where union activists can connect, as you alluded to at the very beginning, with the unemployed, with people who are living on public assistance, with people who may be in the gig economy, right? As a way to begin to connect. I mean, this is a much smaller scale example I'll give you before passing the baton to Clare. But when I lived in Rochester, we had a pretty robust labor education outfit going on. And the main people who were in charge of that, Linda Donahue and John Garlock, were people I learned a lot from about how to organize events that connected with the general public, sort of working class public in Rochester. And it was through, monthly discussions, through labor tours, through factory visits for things I did with students, but also through even a film series, right, which snagged a certain group of folks who were interested in that thing. But I think we have to be engaged in that kind of work as well, right? Like not simply approaching working class people and different constituencies in the midst of a crisis, but slowly starting to build a kind of class consciousness and really an anti-capitalist politics, right? That we need, but that's going to take time. But I just think that there's other ways besides the collective bargaining process and, actual shop organizing that we could use to connect with people.
Claire, we're nearing the end. Same question to you. Are there forms of organizing coming into being? If not, or should there be more, that kind of work both within the normal union sector, union form, but also can help unorganized workers get organized, and I should say help organize the unemployed as well. Are there these kinds of non-traditional union forms?
Yes, there. I mean, there's, I guess, I'm trying to think of a setting in which that happens in the same organization. I mean, I think, in terms of non-traditional union forms, in the last 20 years, a lot of the organizing of low wage, particularly undocumented workers has happened outside of the union context, particularly in worker centers. And this has meant that if you don't have a union, you're not able to collectively bargain a contract. But oftentimes these organizations have been able to organize people to win, either win gains from their employer, although short of a contract, or also, push for legislative changes at a local or state level. And I'm thinking particularly here about, a lot of worker centers have been doing organizing work around wage theft. And this is a particular issue for low-wage workers, and have been able to pass ordinances that help protect workers from losing wages. So this isn't, forming a union, but it is another type of an organization that allows people to come together and fight for their rights on the job. Yeah, and I would just say, within the labor movement, I think that Labor Notes, which is a sort of network that's, a magazine as well as a conference and sort of ongoing workshops, has really been a central site for bringing together rank and file workers who are interested in bringing about change within their union and bringing about democratic change within their union. And certainly, since the 80s, has done a lot of training and work with union members who are looking to create progressive change within their union.
Cedric, just finally, a lot, perhaps maybe most of the people in the streets are workers, young workers, unionized. Probably most of them, or a lot of them, not unionized. Their consciousness now, their focus is very much on the question of systemic racism and police brutality and dealing with the police. But they're workers. What do you say to them about in terms of what they should be thinking about doing?
I mean, what I would hope is that, some of these protests would give way to maybe more forceful redistributive politics, right? Different kinds of discussions about how we should organize the economy or even distribute, public goods within metropolitan context, right? And some of that's already happening. What I'm maybe most afraid of is that while all of my activist friends really see possibility, right? They see, this morphing into some reckoning as far as America's history of racism goes. What I'm also hearing at the same time, from family members, friends, people I've been connected to through different institutions, schools I went to, I'm hearing something that's much more conservative, right? It's really just a demand that America become a less racist place, right? And we hear all the old cliches of earlier periods about leveling the playing field, right? And providing Blacks and all other people with an equal shot at living the American dream as it's already been presented to us, right? Which is, expanded consumer capacity and not necessarily, I'm not always hearing with some of these conversations the kind of criticism I hear from activists, right? So I wonder if there's multiple things happening here at once and that it could possibly go in a fairly conservative place. It's almost the same spirit. Sometimes it feels the same as how people talked about the election of Barack Obama, that this was a new day because it ripped the glass ceiling off of public office, right, where we were finally able to see a Black family in the White House. But I wonder if that's, for some people, that's enough, right? That kind of symbolic reckoning, whether it's taking down monuments, changing the names of streets, pulling films or products that people see as a relic of earlier periods. Like, that may be the extent of it for some folks, right? Maybe in some cities we'll see more substantial changes, but I'm worried that the liberal dimension is more powerful than we think in this contemporary upsurge, right? So once we get beyond the activists, people are just asking to have a fair shot at the game as it already exists. So it would be great if we could see convergence between the kinds of wildcat strikes that Clare mentioned earlier, people organizing in the gig economy, and the outrage that people felt about George Floyd's death and the general treatment of Blacks by police. But I just wonder, right? I don't want to get too excited because we've seen elements of this play out before, and it hasn't always yielded the things that we imagine and hope for.
All right. Thanks very much, Clare. Thank you, Cedric.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And thank you for joining us on the theAnalysis.news podcast.